Welcome to the RES equation version 4. To see previous versions and previous videos, please go to this URL, angeltheory.org, the RES equation with dashes between the RES and equation. Okay, very quickly then, revenue. RES is revenue times efficiency times spin. Revenue, if we say we had investment and other of 5 billion in 2024, January the 1st, and if that was all spent by February the 25th, but 90% of it was spent on two companies in the same network, that would see a 4.5 billion figure available to spend again after that date, so 26th of February. And again, we can see that if those companies again spent, and 90% of that spending was to the same companies in the same network, and that was done by the 19th of April, then again, you can see how it works. It's not hard to work out. What is hard to work out is why no one's done this before, but that is another question. Maybe it's because of the environment. Who knows? When I say the environment, I mean the financial environment, not the environment that we live in. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through this. We've got revenue here. This revenue here, this will the following year, here, you see, that we're going to go to that following year because this first year not a lot happens. All that we're really displaying is there's some aid coming there, 1 billion, and there's some starting revenue there, and once it's done its spinning thing 8 times, it is left with 2.1 billion. The important thing is on the 9th spin, because the money has to go somewhere, it is spinning basically back to the 1st of the month of the next year, therefore it gets included in what can be spent the next year. So there we have the 9th spin, that 2.1 billion, comes to here, which is the law of conservation of revenue this year. It is then added to the aid, plus exports, plus real estate sold, and we're just going to call them for now Charter Cities version 2 started. This isn't actually a development where one is buying to sell real estate. That is 1 billion that is spent. Part of it, yeah, sure, is spent on real estate. Part of it's on infrastructure, sure, but also is buying new companies that are included within this system. And as one can see, but this system is obviously very lucrative. Therefore, that's why the companies would want to be involved in this, and that adds as a little bonus to whatever advantages there were already to buying the real estate. Therefore, there would be a lot of savvy buyers wanting to buy. Supply demand, as long as you've got a very, very good thing to sell, you will sell it as long as there's people who are willing to buy it. And there are lots of companies such as the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, etc. Okay, so that's all we need to know for the second year. And notice there we see the years fly by here. 2026, we started in 2024, and now I'm going to start to just speed up a bit. 2025, 2026. 2026 we see the increase in spin. This is why I need to make it as software, because each time I want to change the spin I have to manually do it. I can't automatically do it. Also for all of these, everything you see here now is controlled by this controller. Sorry, will be controlled by a controller similar to this once we finish the software. Okay, that tells it how it is. Just a note here, this grand total is this figure here, and this figure here. Okay. Important figures as well. This year's cash flow, that's important. Let's just go back to the beginning. 25 billion in cash flow created from 5 billion in revenue. That's the beauty of the spinning if you have a high enough efficiency. In general, from what I've read and from my own experiments, whatever cash flow you have, about half of it ends up as GDP. Government spending is 18.75%. Labour spending is 25%, but one could easily say that 12.5% of what Labour receives would be government spending, i.e. housing for people who doesn't have any housing, welfare for people who are very, very poor, and electric cars. Fair enough, they wouldn't necessarily want to spend their money on that, but seeing as this is a ecological initiative primarily, but you know, that just goes in with the rub. Okay, so let's just carry on down. You see cash flow is increasing there, 2025 to 30. Cash flow increases there to 24, partly because of the 2 extra spins, in part because these figures are generally increasing. Here we can see we're going to 1, 2, 3 different city developments. When I say city development, that is city plus business plus industry. It's not 1 billion on a lavish property development. It's 1 billion on a city. Everything that would be with everything that could be in a city. Okay, so let's just speed this up a bit. Okay, 2028 increases here, increasing the spin to 12 here, and increasing the efficiency to 93. And we're in 2031, increasing the efficiency to 94. All the time, the cash flow for the year is increasing, and therefore so is the GDP and government spending and what Labour receives. Okay, 2033. We're at 118 cash flow. This is the main figure I personally work on, but this is also important here. This is the amount of money that is left, the amount of cash flow that is left that gets span over to the next year. And that figure there, 7.34, ends up down here as part of the revenue, which ends up back here. But we can see here something new. We've got a recession warning, so I have lowered all the forecasts for selling the city-sized developments by half. All of the exports, AIDS stopped paying a while ago. Everything's gone down by half. But if we see here, we've got a cash flow of 118. Because we've gone up to 97 and 2 more spins, even though we've halved all of this income is halved, we actually make more cash flow, therefore we make more GDP. That's the beauty of it. It's different. It's, instead of using reserve rates and all the usual tricks, we just use E and S. Okay, carrying on. The next year, full-blown recession, increase E to 99%, increase spin to 16, decrease all revenue down to only 25% now. We were starting at 127, and the general idea here I think was to try and match that. Sorry, it's 127, and actually no, 138. See, there's growth going on in this economy, whilst the rest of the world is falling apart. Okay, recession is ending, and I'm ratcheting up the spin now, going from. Why didn't we start spin at 20? It's to a degree makes sense to have as high an E and as many spins as you can at the beginning, but there's practicalities. I think it takes a little while to get in the groove of having a high E and having high spin, so that's why it only really crops up here. And what I do after this is a little experiment of lowering the spin and the E, so as when the next recession comes along, we can rack it up again. So, you know, it's that Keynesian thing, really. Keynes, income, you know, when there's a recession, Keynes says spend, spend, spend. well, as long as it's not wasted spending. Spend as much as you can to make up for the lack of demand. But he's very careful to say you've got to make sure you claw that money back as soon as you can, and that isn't in the rhetoric that I'm hearing or have seen from any president. So in this principle, the idea, what I thought would be, let's just see now we're lowering that down to 98. We're lowering it down to 98. And as these start to pick up again, the revenue starts to pick up again. I've gone down to a spin 12 and 97. All at the time maintaining a relatively steady cash flow. Okay, see now we're going down to 95. Let's just carry on now until we see something. I'm not going to go into the left-hand side details. Those can be changed and talked about. And in fact, those are completely, each of these things over here needs its own spreadsheet and its own software and its own gazillion different variables of same. Right. So we're just really, I'm going to focus on here for now. Okay, so we've got a second slowdown predicted. And as soon as that slowdown is predicted, I increase the E to 97. And, yeah, increase the spin to 14. And now, with the recession warning in full blow, you can see to the left, half of all the income. E's up to 100 and stays at 100 and goes up to 120 spin, and all income goes down to 0 except the law of conservation of revenue. That law of conservation of revenue is worked out by it being the last figure here, and that just carries all the way through. There's no money being siphoned off, it's just recycling of that same money and spending it 20 times within the year. So all the rest of the world is coming down again, and at the critical point, at least there's not a loss. You know, it's just staying level. And to be, well, it's not a loss, is it? It's a net gain, because if the rest of the world has dropped 10%, and this Malawi network stayed the same, it's relatively 10% higher. It's just not reflected in the figures. We can't see it here because we don't have the controller. Okay, so there we go. That's depression. Depression ending. And I think this time I kept the E high. Went to see where we could take it. And you can see we're now to pretty high figures. If we see GDP 842 billion, considering that was from a country that started with 5 billion, that's a pretty good improvement. But let's just carry on. Wait till I see something that jumps out. Same thing here, just keeping it high, trying to make as much money really here as possible, whereas before we saw okay, and that's done it there. And if we went over to, let me find it actually, this is the controller. It's a bit of a mess, it's not as good as, what are we looking at, what year are we? That's it, we are looking at this year here, and what I wanted to do is get it to over 1% of share of global GDP based on what was a 2.5% growth figure, which is in any case probably higher than is generally predicted. So yeah, we've seen it go up to have a 1 share of GDP, and the next decade I did something different. I went for stability as much as possible, albeit that stability did not include inflation very much. In fact, yes, it did. What I did was I went down So from its high, I sort of saw this as an artificial high created just to prove the point. I then lowered it deliberately so as it started at 0.8, and then you can see for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, share of global GDP is pretty much static. And the point is, this is done completely by just adjusting the E and the spin. You see there, I've had to go down to 98.5, following year 98.7, following year 98.55, following year 98.7, following year 98.75. These subtle little adjustments to the E is what I'm using to balance the Malawi network economy with global share of GDP of 0.8% approximately. Right, okay, so this year, this decade rather, I've gone for something different, gone to look to buy things, and here we see 222 billion in imports and assets. That could be buying land, it could be buying resources, it could be building entire grand networks in other countries, USA for example, but really any country. And let's just what things to look for is, this was what our reserve was. This was the law of conservation of revenue. This was the revenue that gets spun every year, 240 billion. And you can see how that gets spun. Now, as soon as we lose this money here, that figure goes way down to 67. Okay, so I've ratcheted up 99.5 E, spin 20, and to make that money up. So it's gone up here to 110, gone up to 149, gone up to 186, gone up to 219, and at this point again I bought some more stuff. Maybe I bought a grand network development in, I don't know, the Philippines, yeah, for Chrissy. Chrissy is my copywriter, my very good copywriter. Right, okay, so anyway, same principle as before. Drop the E to create the funds for imports and assets. And in fact, one point here is, I believe, that, yeah, the idea of the last set of assets was that it was global and it would, in general, increase the exports, the non-Malawi exports, and their second big spending of money was to buy things in Malawi, which floods Malawi with cash, not in a way that can be inflated away, because it's US dollars, not Malawi and kwacha. And we can see this because of the because of that flooding and buying of this, that and the other, there's an increased income to Malawi from other Malawi and Africa there afterwards. And from here we just do the same repeat process. We continue with a high E and spin 20 so as we make that money back, make that our LRC back. Okay, and by 2070 we are at 315. Okay, so yeah, the idea now is that there's going to be one hell of a depression coming along, hyperinflation worry. So we're going there. I'm just making more and more money at this point. I've increased to 30 spins, and we see a slowdown predicted. I imagine, yeah, we see all the income falling down, slowdown apparent. E gets higher, all the time increasing in cash flow, increasing the LRC, the reserve. The reserve, I don't know if it's a reserve. I don't know. It's the income that gets rolled over to the following year, so it's just kind of a reserve. Okay, up to 90. Now we can see a recession coming in. Imports lower, cities less lower, and the reason these are less lower than less lower is not good English, sorry. The reason that this is not as low as and especially if we see it the next year, I think we go down to 40 in a depression. Before this went to 0. The reason it's only gone to 40 now is because we're presuming that the other 50 networks that we create, half of those networks are the owners of, or the investors, and they're not having any financial troubles. So only the non-new money, non-new economics countries slow down. Okay, so it's gone up to 32 now and 100. And where is the okay, here it is. We've seen this before, this lowering the E, getting as much cash as we can and use it to buy imports and assets. But before we saw it strategically doing so because it was an experiment, to be quite honest with you. Here it's deliberately doing it to try and stop a major financial disaster, and it's not doing it on its own. And when I first came to do this, I had this on my mind for quite a while. I'm just going to navigate ourselves to the point. Here we are. We can see what's going on. And I'm just going to go to the right and see this here. This is the global GDP, 365 billion. And this is the imports that we just saw here. This amount, which is shedding from the from Malawi's reserves, so to speak. And if we imagine that there's another 50 such networks, in fact, if we say there's actually another 100 such networks, but all of them are only doing half as well as Malawi, then we get this figure here, which was very, very disappointing. 13, I guess that's trillion. Yep, that would be. That's not disappointing. It's disappointing that it's only 3.7% of global GDP, because that's not going to do anything to stop a major depression. The major depression in the USA, I believe, went down 30%. So 3.7%, especially when you've had to shed half of your reserve for it, that's not going to work at all. There's no point doing it. But if the rest of the world was using super economics, if they were using res, or if say America had economic zones where networks grew, then what the rest of the world could do is then pass this cash flow, but when it is spun, it becomes much more. In fact, 70% of the world's GDP can be increased if we had 50 networks similar to the one that I've just shown you, and if they all dumped their cash reserves and started buying stuff, spending all over the world, but only at other networks, that can be spun, that are using the res equation. And this is the end of what I call the peak tent and the Susskind boost philosophy. I guess. It's a string theory philosophy, that's for sure. Yeah, the network will always protect itself. So it actually has an obligation to protect itself. So if the USA dropped 20%, it would have an obligation, if it could, to make sure the USA was saved. So it would maybe get rid of 30% of its 30% of cash flow, spin that, and world is at rights again. That's the idea. Okay, and lastly, just to conclude, I spin up the E, and we just try and make some money back. So as we end up with a reasonable amount of cash flow and GDP, which can be, if we just go to our left, we can see what that is as a percentage of, where would that be? Share of global GDP. There we go. Just to show off, at the very end, we sprinted up to 2.2%. Okay, so there we go. Look forward to seeing you with the new controller. Yeah, this is awesome. This is going to show us how many solar panels we can make, how many electric cars we can buy, how much healthcare, and all sorts of other things. It's going to be made into a game, so people will play it. And the game will be made in such a way that we can use supercomputers to, instead of, this is just one pass. This is one pass, a manual pass that I've done. A supercomputer, I mean, we're talking many trillions and trillions and trillions of different versions of this exact same spreadsheet. Surely is going to be better than my single pass. Of course it will. Okay, that's where we're going. The software, Res v4. Okay, thank you for watching this. Please get in touch. Bye.